Alright guys, Kremp again. I hope you're doing well and enjoying your day. So far, the eagle-eyed Call of Duty fans are back at it again, this time spotting that it seems aBeZy is likely on the move over the next few days, potentially out of Atlanta and going to Texas to join one of a number of teams, probably the Los Angeles Thieves. Is this roster another attempt to reform a similar situation to what OpTic had last year in 2024? Is that going to be the future of their lineup long-term or short-term? And is this actually what's going on for aBeZy, or could there be another team on the horizon instead? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. First of all, a couple of things to go through. We know that Zuma and TJHaLy were getting into that beef a little while ago, and as we know, Zuma's records, players that have played for the Stallions are now getting at least a shot in the league, is pretty good. Even Trakes, who joined Miami Heretics the other day, he's their new fourth instead of Real, so we think Metals is to stay. I'm not sure that's been officially confirmed yet, but Metals, Rencor, Super, Trakes is the expected quartet for Heretics. He was on Stallions for a little bit of time. Mercules, among others, pretty famously spent some time there as well, but TJHaLy says you can't afford me, so that is what it is. Now, speaking of the dynasties in COD history, there is always a debate on what actually counts as a dynasty. Was it just these two on the left-hand side? Did FaZe ever complete a dynasty in some sense? I'm not so sure. I think that FaZe trio definitely had an era, and frankly, that era has been over the last, pretty much the entirety of the CDL. There was also the Furico Impact team that won like 3 events in a row, and they won the World Championship as well back in Black Ops 2. But in the grand scheme of things, that wasn't long enough to be considered any sort of dynasty. So there's really only 2 dynasties, and Complexity being the first, and in some respects the most dominant in terms of series win percentage and stuff like that. They played 138 series together. Now, pretty interesting numbers, pretty much comparing how many 3-0s they had to how many times they got 3-0s. And that's very rare. I mean, FaZe, I'm actually surprised there's 12. I think that number was pretty slim over the first few years, but it did increase a little bit. But anyway, Complexity, they had 50 series where they won 3-0. A lot of this was because Complexity were, Aches was kind of famous for saying that they didn't really care about search and destroy. They just knew that they were better at, in Ghost, for example, it was, we played Domination, but it was Domination and Blitz. They just knew they were so much better at the actual respawn modes that if they lost to search and destroy, it was like, whatever, we're still going to beat these cats 3-1, and they did basically all the time. If they did go 3-2, then they would kind of try and win the search and destroy, but they didn't even really, they weren't trying all the time to put their opponents to bed 3-0 every single series. Still, they won 36% of their series in a 3-0 fashion, and they only got 3-0'd 5 times in that time frame, which is the lowest percentage out of all of these teams. Now, the OpTic dynasty, by these numbers, is maybe even the most impressive, just when you keep in mind that the OpTic dynasty was together for longer than Complexity by quite a way. It's not like Cole weren't together long, because they were, but OpTic, we're talking the entirety of the Jetpack era pretty much, and the World War II season when they were still together before they blew up, and of course the World War II year was not great for them. So even given that, still 40% of their series they won 3-0, which is pretty wild. Basically, not far off half the time they would 3-0 their opponents. And yeah, you might argue they had a lot of pool play games they were playing in the early days. They were farming on some other teams, but you could equally argue that were the FaZe trio farming on some terrible teams in the CDL for some time. It's always difficult to compare the eras, right? But it's easy to say in hindsight. 3-0 defeats, only 11 of those. And then, of course, the FaZe trio, they played the most series out of any of these teams and were, of course, together the longest from Modern Warfare 19. Of course, Simp and aBeZy together in Black Ops 4. Cellium came along after that. There was a time, in Cold War and stuff, where they were just 3-0ing it. Felt like they were just throwing everyone for fun. That percentage ended at about 30%, which is still insane, by the way, right? Like, to win near enough a third of your series 3-0 is very impressive, but it's maybe not as high as it could have been, right? 82 3-0 wins, OpTic at 106 in their time as a team. All of these that we're talking about on the screen here had, one ring, right? Complexity in 2014, OpTic 2017, and then FaZe in 2021. So thought it was interesting to look at the numbers anyway to kind of compare, to some degree, the dynasties that we've had. But speaking of aBeZy and speaking of FaZe, pretty much all those guys are going their separate ways. aBeZy had a message for the team, he's out of there. Cellium had a message for the team, he's out of there. Drazah had a message for the team, or for the fans, and he's back, right? He is not going going anywhere anytime soon. There has been a question about this new Thieves team. We'll talk about the thing that's been leaked last night and the rumours about it as a result, but let's say this is indeed the roster that is formed with Los Angeles Thieves. There's going to be some interesting comparisons to be made to what's happened the most recent season with Thieves, and also another team that had good success over the last couple of seasons, and that of course being the OpTic Texas roster from last year that also appeared this year, but to rather, less effect at the start of the season. They made some changes and things went rather well. But people are going to compare, okay, if aBeZy comes in for Envoy, if Kenny comes in for Ghosty effectively, is that a step in the right direction or not? I think many people are pretty excited about this aBeZy move. Of course, there are questions on Kenny, whether in the Omni Movement titles that we just had and we are going to have again, he's really the man for the job. I think that he quite possibly still is, but understandably there has been some debate on whether that's true or not. So people are comparing it to last year's Thieves team that of course had great success, Major 3, Major 4, but at the start of the season they fell short, and at the end of the season they fell short as well. So I think they felt like they needed to upgrade to some degree if they wanted to keep up with what OpTic were doing at the end of the season, and also bringing in Kenny on paper should be a pretty good thing for your success at the end of the season. Typically Kenny's teams do pretty well at the tail end of the season, tends to be a pretty good player of the World Championship, stuff like that. So there's some reasons why this might be valuable, but I think many were comparing it to last year's Thieves team and saying, okay, they did very well. They topped the CDL standings, let's not forget, Thieves last year, finally dethroning FaZe, but it wasn't really good enough when it mattered at the end of the season. But you could also understandably compare them to the OpTic 2024 roster that won the World Championship. You can say, okay, you've got Kenny. Now, you could argue, is he the same Kenny that he was a couple of years ago in, maybe Modern Warfare 3 was a game that suited him better than Black Ops 6? I don't think there's any doubt about that. What will be the case in Black Ops 7? That's a fair debate. Will he have other people in the team to bounce ideas off, let's say, like he did with Shotzzy, and to debate what the correct way to play the game actually is? Possibly yes, but if you look at it, Star AR, Scrap versus Dashy, they don't play in quite the same way. They could if they wanted to, but absolutely two of the most comparable ARs in the league right now, and in terms of raw gunny, raw talent. If you're OpTic and hypothetically you are forced to replace Dashy, you would try and go and get Scrap, and if you were Thieves trying to replace Scrap, you would go and get Dashy. That is just the way that it is. So those two are as, interchangeable, I think, from that perspective anyway, as it get to the top of the league. Then you've got HyDra and Shotzzy, not identical SMG players for sure in terms of the way that they approach the game, but Kremp and others have debated that in many respects they can do pretty similar things in terms of their effectiveness for the team. They go about that in slightly different ways. HyDra's more of a raw slayer, Shotzi's more like a, do it all on the map and all this type of stuff, but the partnership with Pred therefore worked very well for a time, and you've got to think that this HyDra aBeZy partnership as well on paper could be pretty insane if aBeZy's able to kind of unlock an absolute just raw slaying version of HyDra that might be very deadly, and then Kenny to round out the team. So you can understand why there has been some comparisons between these two rosters. Yeah, there's only one player in common, but outside of that, and their SMG duo will probably go about their business in a rather different way, but still, right, you can understand why there are some comparisons here. Now, aBeZy, is he actually going to go to Thieves, right? There was interest, we thought, from the Falcons. They were going to pay maybe some money to go and get him. That has either not transpired for whatever reason, unless there's some last-minute swoop that one of these teams is trying to make happen. And just because the rumour has it, based on these images right here, that aBeZy is on the move, doesn't necessarily mean he's guaranteed going to Thieves. But we know that the FaZe guy is based in Atlanta over the last few years, and, well, aBeZy's leaving FaZe. That's now been confirmed. So where's he going to go? And wherever he is going to go, possibly this is going to happen very soon indeed. So people have been watching his stream. Bobo, I mean, I thought this was quality investigative work here. This is a screenshot from his, well, stream a little while ago. And you can see in the background, he's got all sorts of stuff here. You've got this E-United jersey when he won the World Championship with in 2019 framed on the wall. There's a picture of it as well in the background. There's all sorts of stuff on all of these shelves in the background. background. Now, you fast forward to pretty much the present day, and that will now look something like this. So we can compare the two shots kind of side by side, and pretty much most things are the same in the foreground, but in the background it's pretty evident that apart from what might be like, you know, an internet router or something, basically everything else has got off the shelves, right? Like all this has been cleared away, all of it's been, you know, packed up for some reason, and look, maybe there's nothing to it, but probably there's something to it, right? It's pretty plausible anyway that aBeZy's packed all his stuff away. He's either shipped it to where he's going to go next, or he's just preparing to move somewhere, right? That would be the theory. Now look, is he going to go to Texas? Good question. Most of the teams, though, are based in Texas, so it would make some degree of sense. Thieves fans were based, or Thieves were based there last year, and likely that they will be again. So wherever aBeZy currently is, I think it makes sense probably for him to go to Texas for various reasons, but especially if the Thieves guys are based there, it only makes a certain amount of sense as well. So it seems like that is very plausible that in the coming days we can expect aBeZy to, you know, get out there, and, you know, maybe the announcement is coming relatively soon as well. Does remind me a little bit of this, if you guys remember. This is late 2020, so Dallas Empire had won the World Championship, and the very next day it was confirmed that Call of Duty would be going back to 4 versus 4, and someone had to get dropped. It turned out that it was going to be Clay. Now, in the background of this picture, you guys might remember, you can just about see it in the bottom right-hand side, was a hat that people were wondering, is that a scuff hat? Is that a New York Subliner's hat? Like, what's going on? And a few days later, Clayser confirmed that, you know, yeah, people were obviously talking about it a lot, and yes, it turned out indeed he was joining the New York Subliners for the upcoming season, as we very well remember. So, it was a little bit of that going on here, right? People doing a little bit of journalism, or investigative journalism, whatever, looking at the stuff in the backgrounds. But yes, aBeZy's probably on the move. Does that guarantee that it's going to be the Thieves? Not necessarily, but more than likely this will be the case. And will the roster be any good? That is also a very good question. So very much into your thoughts in a comment. Just one final thing, as Brian Stat says, which zero-time champions are the most likely to win their first career chip in Black Ops 7? So, you know, not world champions, but just players that haven't won a championship yet. Pretty interesting, because there's a lot of big names on here, right, that have not ever won any sort of championship. Now, a number of players, of course, on here have come very close. Neptune, 04, Abuzah, and Nastie, that entire Surge team came very close but didn't win. Nastie has not won a championship either. Now, he's not yet being linked to a team, but let's say he joins Toronto, and that Toronto team becomes JoeDeceives, Real, CleanX, Nastie. You know, is that a team that could potentially, you know, with Joe, Real, and Nastie potentially win? Something to think about. Neptune on the Gentlemates, Exnid on the Falcons. I mean, I don't know. We'll see how the Falcons get on, right, the new season. 04 and Abuzah on FaZe. And then the full Heretics team also not yet won a championship, right? So despite how good Rencor has been, obviously he's only been here a year, but you know, it's interesting that Neptune, given how good he has been, look, they came very close, right? They didn't win anything. Likely, unless, as we say, the Thieves team or the OpTic team or whatever just dominate the upcoming season, somebody at some point will get a championship on the board of these teams, you would imagine. And, look, it's not guaranteed, but usually there's at least an outside winner at some point in the season. And what's the most likely, right? Brian says that he thinks 04 and Abuzah are going to win their first chip. He thinks that FaZe are going to get over the line at some point, which with Simp and Drazah, you can't count that out by any means at all. Maybe Heretics can go one step further this year, but you could argue that maybe last year with Real, you know, was their year to have the success, and last year's game, I think, suited that team and the way they want to play COD very well, but not to say that Black Ops 7 will not necessarily. So very much into your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. I might do a second video today, but I probably won't. There's not been that much happening over the last few days. There's a few interesting things I still want to talk about, but I might well save them for when there's a little bit more else happening in the scene and these roster things go a little bit next level. So hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.
They're on mid, they're on mid.
They're mid, one shot, they're mid.
And they're mid stone, they're mid stone too.
Try me mid. B, one shot, B bomb. Yo, Bridge said bomb and...
Bridge stairs is trap, right? He's still there.
I'm
Mid alley, bro, mid alley.
That was on bomb.
Oh my god. Stay down.
Oh! Give me 4!
Holy shit.
Holy shit.
Holy shit. Holy shit. Okay, Terry. Okay.